Yeah. Now, something that's worth noting here, Aaron Wrenn, who has the thesis about the negative world, which I think is exactly right, he pointed out that without Christianity, all the things that depend on Christianity that we have right now as, well, essentially borrowed capital, are going to run out. So things like freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, limited government, all of these things have roots in Christian thought. This is really where they come from. Limited government is a product of original sin. I mean, the idea of original sin leads to limited government, things like that. So if you lose Christianity, all of these things inevitably erode. And it seems to me that's what Richard Dawkins, to pick the prime example, he wants cultural Christianity, but he doesn't want Christians. It seems to me that, it seems obvious you can't do that. And Dawkins, one would think, would realize that you can't have the fruit without the root.
But doesn't this also show one of the challenges? I'm going to push back a bit on your critique of what you're calling common sense philosophy. Traditional Christian philosophy, both Protestant and Catholic, from, I would argue, going back to the Bible, always had a robust view of what many Christians have called general revelation. General revelation did not cancel out special revelation. It was not better than special revelation because God's clear words in the Bible are supreme. But whether it be Psalm 19 or Romans 1 or throughout the Bible, when God appeals to people's sense of justice saying, judge for yourself, this is not fair, he's actually presuming that there is some sort of revelation that we have written on our hearts. John Calvin was very clear on this in the Institutes of Religion. Martin Luther was clear on that. And so I'd say I'd sort of flip it. In my view, one of the reason why the Unitarians took over or the reason why Christians lost their influence was because they actually abandoned the idea of general revelation. And they retreated into the idea is, well, the Bible is the only thing we know, which sends to the message to the people who are not Christians is that, well, if we're not Christians, we're not responsible for not knowing that because that's just your religious view. And Christians ceded that. And in fact, Dawkins is a good example of that because Dawkins says, you're just living in the realm of the fairy story of the Bible, which I don't believe, so you have no claim on me. I have reason. You have your fairy story. But the fact is, he didn't have reason. And I'd say that if we want to get around that, we can't simply extol the Bible in a culture that does not believe in it. We actually have to reassert the arguments that people like John Witherspoon, and if you actually look at Princeton, all the places when they were Christians, they had a very developed theology and philosophy. It did have, Thomas Reed, I think, makes a lot of good arguments, and a lot of Christians who argued for vigorous general revelation, not to surmount or replace the primacy of the Bible, but to go along with it so that when you have people like the Dawkins and claim that, well, Christianity is unreasonable, you're just in the realm of fairy stories. No, we're not. Actually, the very heavens declare the glory of God. The things that we see in the things that my colleagues at Discovery Institute study, the molecular machines inside us, you cannot understand reasonably apart from the product of design and purpose. So that forces you to raise the question that there is something out there more than blind, purposeless processes. Then I would say that the biblical revelation tells you who that is. So I guess my concern is that if you go to the realm and thinking the Bible only, and you cede general revelation, which again, Christians, Protestant, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox have proclaimed from the early church fathers, this is, if you give that up, then that actually is part of the recipe for why Christians had no influence in the past, several generations.
Well, thank you very much. You have defended American theologians very ably, but the founders would disagree with you. They had better sense. They said, we hold these truths to be sacred, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. So they understood, and I'll give you a practical example, they understood that the right to life comes from the Creator, not from general revelation. 2 weeks ago, on 17th of October, I was in Calgary speaking in the Alberta Prayer Breakfast. The Premier was there and many politicians. And Canada had just expelled 6 Indian diplomats because they hired a criminal to kill a Sikh who was Canadian citizen in Canada about a year ago. So Prime Minister Trudeau had just made a public statement that government of India is assassinating Canadian citizens on Canadian soil, and this is not acceptable. So I began my talk by saying that this is very interesting that you should invite an Indian to speak when your government is expelling Indian diplomats. So everybody laughed, but then I turned it against them by saying that would the Prime Minister say that it's okay for the government of India to kill Indian citizens on Indian soil? Is it okay for Canadian government to kill Canadian citizens on Canadian soil? It was never self-evident in India that general revelation gave inalienable right to life to everyone. The fact that every citizen has a right to life and the government is created to defend God-given right to life comes from the command, you shall not kill. You might be David, but you might be the king. You have no right to covet your neighbor's wife, to kill her husband, to commit adultery. You're violating God's word. This is not general revelation. This revelation, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, you shall not commit adultery, is given precisely because the human nature is to hate your own wife and covet your neighbor's wife, and to commit adultery. So divine revelation goes against the general tendency of the human heart, which American theology has been defending in the name of general revelation, and consequently undermining the necessity of divine revelation which must rule over the governments.
I don't deny the need for divine revelation or some of the unique things that you can only find in the Bible, but what you just said, I don't see how one squares with, let's talk about C.S. Lewis and the abolition of man. One of the things that he did for that, which I think is very helpful, is he used a volume, I actually have it at home, from the early 1900s called the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics. And he went through, and this, for those of you who've read The Abolition of Man, the ending appendices that have all of these moral sayings that are not just from cultures that are based on the Bible. Ancient Egypt, some from India, Confucius. You find things like, in most of the world's civilizations, most of them do not prize lying to each other. They do not prize treating your elders and your parents with abuse. They don't, there are rules of general and specific beneficence, rules of fair dealing. Those are actually the negative golden rule of not doing to others that which you don't want done to you. Christ actually makes it positive. That's a very great, I don't want to say innovation, but a great advance. But the negative golden rule you find in most of all these cultures. And so I think it's pretty hard to factually, empirically, to argue that to know, and that's different from, yes, we're sinful. Our tendency for our sinful hearts is to go against the law that we actually know, in many cases, is what we're doing is wrong. But throughout the world, you have these basic moral things that are written on our hearts. And this was actually the standard view of the Reformation. You find it on the 2 Laws of Moses, an essay written by Luther. You find it in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, where actually Calvin talks about that the moral law is nothing, the 10 Commandments is nothing more than the moral law, written on our hearts, that God is talking about the natural moral law. So this isn't just the Americans, and it was the wording, I think, was sacred and undeniable.
It was changed.
No, I understand. But I don't disagree with, this is a difference of, yes, we're sinful, yes, we rebel against that, and that is something, although I'd agree with Timothy Dwight that original sin is one of the few things that is so self-evident, because everyone can see that the way we act, even in our own hearts to other people, it's like the evidence is all around us for original sin.
Well, I'm grateful that you don't disagree, but I do disagree with you. I feel that it is the interpretation of general revelation which has messed up America. It was never self-evident in any culture that all men are created equal. It was never self-evident in any culture, not even amongst the Jews, that a man must love his wife. Every culture allowed a man to divorce his wife, to take a second wife, a third wife, a fourth wife. The command, husbands, love your wife, is not a human value. It is a command because it goes against human nature. So I do disagree, and I am asserting that America is messed up because what belonged to God's word, we have ascribed to human sense. We need the command, husbands, love your wife, precisely because we prefer our neighbor's wife. She doesn't ask us to get up in the middle of the night to change diapers, etc.
Just as an interesting example that somehow fits into this, I'm not quite sure how, but when you look at Locke's 3 rights, life, liberty, and property, he came up with, particularly on property rights, he came up with a secular explanation of why based on the labor theory of property. But actually, all of them are anchored in Genesis. God gave human beings life, therefore you cannot arbitrarily take it away from them. God gave human beings liberty. Liberty it's not the same as freedom. It is the freedom to make choices within boundaries set by divine and natural law. So God gave Adam freedom to eat of any tree except that one over there. So that was the boundary. So you've got liberty in that context. And I hinted at this in my talk earlier. The right to property is there as well. Tend the garden, eat the fruit.
Yes.
So all of those rights that Locke identified are actually coming out of Genesis 1 and 2. We don't need 3. All of them were also identified by medieval theologians.
Yes.
But, yeah.
But are you denying, is there any general revelation in you? Let me just give one more example from Augustine.
But you can't read into general revelation equality of all human beings. You can't read into general revelation inalienable rights. The right to property comes from the command, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. You alluded to Luther's work ethic in your talk. You shall not covet meant you shall create. You want better house, you want better vineyard, create your own vineyard, don't covet your neighbor's vineyard. So what he works for, he owns. So what he creates, what you create, what you inherit is yours. So no culture has had inalienable right to property.
That's true.
George Washington, for him, one of the most important verses in the scriptures, it's not one verse, but several verses, that each man sitting under his own fig, his own wine. This was a very important motive in Israel, which is what Exodus meant, that here you're laboring for Pharaoh, there you will labor for yourself. You will own your own vineyard, you will own your own fig tree, you will have a right, no one will to make you afraid. So this was a uniquely revealed right. You shall create your own wealth, not covet your neighbor's wealth. Ascribing it to general revelation is a fundamental problem with American theology.
Just two quick things. One is, if you look at how America is messed up, the time it's been most messed up is actually in the last 150 years, not before then. And so, in fact, the time when most American Christians had a robust view of general revelation, that the Bible went along with those, that they reinforced each other. The Bible is absolutely true, but that you couldn't get out of it by saying that if we didn't, if we weren't Christians, then we weren't subject to the Bible. No, the Bible teaches things that are absolutely true, and so the things that we find from reason go along with that. And at the time that Christians believed that, in the 19th century, I think our nation was actually much better. It was actually in the last 150 years when Christians have overwhelmingly rejected general revelation, especially many Protestant Christians, that actually things got so messed up. But let me just go on one specific thing.
What's interesting there is that rejection of general revelation corresponds with the development of social gospel. The idea being that human beings aren't fallen, they're not sinful, so we don't need evangelism, so all that's left is social action. And then what happens in consequence of that is the conservatives say, no, 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 humans are sinful, they need salvation, they need their sins forgiven, so they forget the social action side of it. Those two had always worked together. They get bifurcated in the 19th century, right at the point where the general revelation and special revelation splits occurring. It all fits together.
I agree with you on that. And I'd say even more that when you reject, when in the mid-19th century, when Darwin comes about, and then you have Marx, and then a little later you have Freud and Nietzsche, who say that if you really believe in reason, science shows that we're the product of blind, purposeless process and there's no God. And too many Christians saying, okay, that's right. We're convinced. General revelation or reason shows us that we don't have any good arguments, so we'll just be refuge in our Christian ghettos just in the Bible, rather than extolling that reason and revelation say the same things. And then that sets up that the only thing left is social action, or on the conservative side, a narrow evangelism that doesn't lead to the discipleship, which is in fact what you talked about. But can I just say just one other thing? And then I'll be quiet for a while, on this idea, I actually would agree with you that the idea that all men are created equal is something that goes back to, you don't find that in ancient Greece, you don't find that in Rome, that is something distinctively taught by the Christian scriptures. Where I would disagree with you is you bring in covetousness and all these other things as if there's no general revelation. I just say that has not been the view of the Protestant reformers. It wasn't the view of Augustine. Augustine has a wonderful little sermon about actually when people say, well, I don't believe in stealing isn't wrong. And so he goes on, it's very much like C.S. Lewis. I don't know if C.S. Lewis read this sermon by Augustine. He's getting it sort of from Paul. Well, okay, you say that stealing isn't wrong, but if I steal from you, are you going to say the same thing? You may say that adultery isn't wrong, but if I take your wife, are you going to say that? And this is part of his argument that people, yes, we rebel, yes, we're sinful, but the idea that there is no moral law written on our hearts, really, that we rebel against, that makes people who do not know the Bible accountable. That's not the standard Christian position. That's not the standard biblical
Nobody's
position.
saying that non-Christians are not made in God's image. That we heard very clearly. But to read into that that it is common sense, self-evident, that all men are created equal. Harvard University was established in 1636. In 1776, you have the Declaration. Only in 1889, the first black student is admitted in Harvard. Only in 1950, the first female student is admitted in Harvard Law College. It was never self-evident to Harvard University that male and female are equal. So to read into general revelation that we are made in God's image, therefore it is self-evident to Harvard University that men and women are created equal. This is the nonsense of American theology, of reading into general revelation things which came from the Bible. In Europe, the first person who understood human equality on the basis of priesthood and kingship of all believers was Luther. In America, the first white man who began preaching to the blacks was George Whitefield. And Whitefield was hated because the slave owners began to say, "What are you doing? Do you want us to sit with our slaves on the same pews and drink the communion from the same cup?" Whitefield made 13 trips across Atlantic to support John Wesley. He needed money. Slaves had no money to give him. Slave owners had the money, and they were angry at him. So from 1740, Whitefield started writing, expounding that all men are created equal. And Benjamin Franklin was Whitefield's mouthpiece, amplifier. So this was a unique teaching that Whitefield gave to America, which Luther had already discovered 200 years earlier in Germany, that all men are created equal. So you stole, as Richard Dawkins is doing, what American theologians did was to steal from revelation, special revelation, and ascribe it to general revelation. That this is common sense, this is self-evident. That's why you lost your university.
Now, just as a point of information, George Whitefield did not need anybody to magnify his voice. But now, one of the things that I understand.
Benjamin Franklin, hero worshipped Whitefield.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I just sort of realized is we've been crossing categories here. You were talking about epistemology at first, but suddenly it's in ethics, as we're moving into commandments and things like that. So I think part of the difficulty in the conversation may have been that, that there's this crossing categories between epistemology and ethics. I think that you're exactly right. I would modify it a little bit, but the idea that human equality is common sense is not common sense. It is only common sense in the context of a biblical worldview. If you have a biblical worldview, if this is the thing that has shaped the way you see the world, the way you see humanity, all of those kinds of things, then yes, it will come across to you as common sense. My working definition, one of my working definitions of worldview is what you think of as common sense about the world. So if you actually have a fully formed biblical worldview, then that will seem to you as common sense. But you've got to recognize that that is, in fact, anchored in revelation, in Scripture, because that's what forms the idea.
Except historically, unfortunately, and tragically, some of the biggest supporters of slavery were Christians who understood themselves and made biblical arguments for slavery. And in fact, the change, if you look after the bad revolution, which I think actually was a good revolution, and the proclamation of human equality, it was after 1776 that you had something like 12 states, most of in the North, that began to pass anti-slavery laws. That's because, I would argue, that you have what should be the true understanding of the Bible, because going back to the very earliest I say the biblical text itself and the early church fathers and others, you actually do have arguments for human equality, reinforced by the general revelation arguments. That actually, in America, is what ultimately brought to the end slavery.
Now, we have to be careful here, because we're dealing with an American context. Yeah. If you look at the broader history of the church, anti-slavery goes way back. That's actually the mainstream view of the church.
No, I understand
the American view is an aberration.
But we're living in the aberration. The point I'm making is if you go up the abolition movement in America, what actually made it ultimately win out was that you had the evangelicals and Christians who joined together with people who were largely, like William Lloyd Garrison and others who were not Christians, and they formed, because they found common ground and they reinforced each other, and then it became ultimately the social argument. And where you actually see this, a good of these things going together is actually, it's thought of, it's trite now, but it really wasn't. You know, one of the most powerful novels of the 19th century was Uncle Tom's Cabin, and done by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a very devout Christian, daughter of Lyman Beecher. And it's a very Christian book, but it's also a very general revelation book. It's a very complex book, and the reason it was so powerful, I would argue, in transforming people's minds is because it had those things go together. And when we tear them apart and say, well, we're just going to be in our ghetto that, you know, only people who, if you say that you can only know any basic truths about the world just from special divine revelation, then you're setting it up for the rest of the people in the culture who aren't Christians saying, well, then I don't have to care anything you're saying. It's only when you insist that, as Christians traditionally have insisted, that God speaks with one voice through the Bible, but also through general revelation, and they reinforce each other, so there's no escape hatch. If you're not a Christian, there's no escape hatch to say, well, I don't have to pay attention to, you know, not stealing or other things, because that's just in the Bible. Well, it is in the Bible. And I would argue the Bible gives you an anthropology to understand it, but that doesn't mean that God also didn't, by the fact that we were creating an image of God, write it on our hearts.
Thank you. You're right that Rodney Stark, in For the Glory of God, his chapter on slavery is one of the finest, and he points out that all the arguments in support of slavery were secular arguments, even when made by Christians, economic arguments. All the arguments against slavery were biblical arguments but what it points out, what slavery in America points out, is that Christianity in America can be evil. And this was a shameful chapter in America where pastors and elders and ordinary Christians believed. I mean, Whitefield had slaves, and at the end of his life, he wanted more slaves. But he was championing that all men are created equal. So there was tension in his own life. But it's true, and we'll discuss it tomorrow, truth transforms, but truth has to be fought for. And to assume that truth comes from general revelation, that all men are created equal, it is self-evident. This is where epistemology is the foundational issue, that if it is common sense, if it is self-evident, why do we need special revelation? But it is, if you look actually at the history of how Harvard University was lost, the debates that happened, it was American faith and common sense, which meant that one Father, one Son, one Holy Spirit cannot be one God. This is common sense. You needed revelation, and American theologians did not stand up for revelation, quoting Augustine, quoting this, quoting that, Locke, about general revelation. And the faith was in self-evident common sense rather than in sola scriptura. So this is the fundamental problem, that it is American theology which deceived America and deceived the world, that human equality, human rights are self-evident truths. They are not.
I'm afraid at this point, we have gone over time. So I thank you, Vishal and John, and thank you all for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast.
Thank you.